I remember the day that John F. Kennedy was shot. The announcement came over the loudspeaker in school. I was in social studies class I was in what was called junior high back in those days. I guess it's now called middle school. I'm not sure. The schools have changed over the years. And teachers were crying. Kids were crying. The buses were called. We were all sent home early. Everything was closed down. And it was a very sad day in America.
It had to be 6th grade. I must have been in 6th grade. And I remember them making the announcement over the loudspeaker, and we all had to go back to our homerooms or classrooms or whatever it was. And then everything just stopped. Everything just stopped. Classes stopped. Nothing. Everything just stopped. And then the buses came and took us home.
The day that John F. Kennedy was shot.
Yeah. New Paltz blew up like a balloon during the weekend of Woodstock because there was so many people that they couldn't get any further than X amount of exits on the throughway. They could only get as far as New Paltz. They couldn't get any further than New Paltz. And it really mushroomed into this huge thing.
Woodstock was the summer of 1969. I was pregnant for my first daughter. So therefore I didn't go, but many of my friends did go. As a matter of fact, my first husband went. Woodstock was another event that created a lot of chaos and discord in a lot of families. We watched what was going on TV. It was the era of love, peace, let it all hang open. I mean, drugs, sex, the whole 9 yards. There were babies born there. There were, all types of things took place.
The Beatles.
The Beatles.
British invasion.
Okay. Oh my God, I can't even remember the amount of names of all the different bands.
Ed Sullivan Show.
1964, I can remember sitting in the living room, your living room, although actually it was only half the size at that point, with my face like 2 inches away from the TV, while watching them get off at Idlewild Airport. That's what JFK used to be called, Idlewild. Got off the plane, and people, girls were like hanging off the railings and screaming and fainting, and they got on Ed Sullivan, and you could hardly hear them because of all the screaming in the audience.
Well, I had cousins who lived in the UK who came here before the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan, and they had 45s of the Beatles from Europe before they were known here, and like singles like "Put On Your Dancing Shoes" or something like that. I don't think ever made it onto albums like the Beatles did released in the US. But so when the Beatles came on Ed Sullivan, I knew about them already, but they weren't considered a big deal. Like they really took off then. But I was really happy that something changed in American music because I think Winchester Cathedral had been on top of the pop charts for 43 weeks. And it was getting a little old.
Oh, the Beatles. I remember when they were on the Ed Sullivan Show and everybody went crazy. And they were the biggest thing to hit this country from London for young men and their crazy music. And I personally have never really cared for the Beatles, and I know you'll think I'm crazy. And I still don't. They have a few songs I love, but I never was crazy over them. I had friends who actually camped out for 2 days. When they came to Radio City Music Hall in the city, they went there and they actually slept for 2 days. My girlfriends went there. They all thought I was crazy because I was not interested. I've never and will never camp out to see anybody for 2 days. But they were a big thing in this country for a lot of young girls. They were screaming and crying and fainting, and I don't know if I was just different than other people or more mature, or I'm really not sure what it was, but I just didn't get it.
The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was not good.
It was a fiasco.
Yeah. What did life feel like at the time? Like, I know it probably didn't affect
Yeah, I don't
everything
remember,
too
I don't
much.
remember that, so it's too long.
I was, what, 8
Mhm.
when the Bay of Pigs took place. But I took flying lessons 10 years later, 11 years later, with an instructor who was a pilot who was supposed to be flying in to support the Bay of Pigs. For the experience of people involved in it, it was horrible. It was an embarrassment politically for the United States.
What do you remember about the moon landing?
I remember watching it for sure and thinking it was, but a lot of it was so far removed, you know, it was, and even back then, you're so used to watching movies and science fiction and TV shows to really get the understanding and the reality that this guy was really walking for real on the moon.
Yeah.
It was all exciting. Like I loved all the Mercury, you know, the solo missions, the Mercury missions, and the Apollo missions. Apollo was the second one, right?
Yeah.
And then when they did Gemini was the second two.
Oh, right.
And then Apollo was the moon trips, and of course then there was the Apollo 13 one where they got in trouble and they were lucky to make it back. So that was kind of dramatic, but really,
Was that 69?
yeah,
I think that was late 60s.
yeah, but really, it's like the sad thing was like when we won the race to the moon, the race was over and the funding dried up and it stopped being significant. And that's a huge disappointment.
During the 60s, there were a lot of changes made as far as exploring space. John Glenn orbited the moon 3 times early on in the 60s, but if I remember correctly, I think it was in 1969 that Neil Armstrong actually landed Apollo 2 on the moon. It was televised. It was one of the biggest events in history, and it made opened up a whole new door as far as space and exploration went.
Well, that's my first question, the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Well, I can remember how it all led up to going there. I can remember that it wasn't a popular situation. My own belief was, at the time, I thought we did belong there, so I was game. You know, when I found out I was going there, I didn't try to get out of it. I was actually an enlisted man, so I didn't get in. I wasn't drafted into it. And at the end of the tour, I got orders to be separated in San Diego. And I went to San Diego and I got separated. And that was in 1971.
What do you know about the Vietnam War?
Vietnam,
What were your experiences?
My only experiences with the Vietnam War is how it divided my family. I have one brother who went into the Air Force. I had another brother who was totally against the Vietnam War, as was I. I had lost my first true love, was killed in Vietnam. 3 of my other good friends were killed in Vietnam. My cousin was killed in Vietnam. And I came from a family that was very service-oriented. My father had been in World War II. My grandfather had been in World War I. But it divided a lot of families because a lot of us did not believe that we had any business being over there. They didn't want us there. We were fighting a war that we had no business being involved in. And then there were other people who were 100% for all this. And the saddest part of it was when the boys came back from Vietnam, it wasn't like other wars where our veterans were honored. They were spit on. They were called baby killers. A lot of young men took off for Canada to avoid the draft. During that era, there was a draft. They weren't given a choice. And there were many protests. And it was quite a time. Martin Luther King was in the early 60s. There was the March in Alabama. I remember, I believe that was around 1962, 63. I had a lot of black friends. I've never had prejudice. I didn't grow up in a home where prejudice was really tolerated. I spent most of my life with my grandmother, and at the end of the street where she lived, it was a black orphanage, so I'd always been around black children. Again, we had a lot of discord, a lot of protesting, many people who were against the movement and many people who were for the movement. But Martin Luther King, I think, made a big difference in what wound up happening in America and what has happened since. I think he was a phenomenal man. He did wonderful things. It was a tragedy when he was assassinated.
The I Have a Dream speech was the high point of his speaking on civil rights. But it was not the speech that got him shot. The speech that got him shot was a speech against the Vietnam War sometime later.
Cuban Missile Crisis was a little bigger, I think. It was a little more scary.
Yeah, we were hiding under our desks in grammar school, waiting for a nuclear attack during that. But the Cuban Missile Crisis was not something that took place in a vacuum. The United States had agreed to place missiles in Turkey to defend Turkey against the Soviet Union, and that was considered too close. It was, intrusive on Soviet space. So the Soviets decided they were going to put missiles in Cuba to do essentially the same thing the other way, and it became like a very high-level game of chicken.
Well, this again was during the 60s, and it changed things for blacks across the country, primarily in the South. There were a lot of killings, bombings before all this happened, but I think it's one of the biggest changes, again, that happened during the 60s to move things in the right direction for this country as far as equality. I still think we have a long way to go, although we've made tremendous strides over the years, and I'm in my 60s. I can say that we still have a long way to go. Things still aren't equal. And I'm a white person saying this.
You have to remember that for the decade before that, black people in the South and white people who supported equal rights for black people in the South were being murdered, and under the sanction of law in southern states, or at least the cover of the law. But that couldn't be sustained. You also have to remember that in the civil rights movement there were forces for nonviolent change, and there were also sources for violent change, like the Black Panthers, who were also active and making a great deal of noise in the North. Took over Columbia University. There was a lot of protest, and they couldn't be ignored.
It was a big breakthrough for women. I remember as a teenager, I had a few friends who had gotten pregnant, and back in the days before there was birth control and before they could get legal abortions, and these things were available to them, especially people who didn't have money. If you had money, you could basically go elsewhere. You didn't have to worry about these things. But we had what we call back alley butchers. Young girls were getting infections. They would wind up never being able to have children. And I know a lot of people don't have any use for your Planned Parenthoods and your birth control and this and that, but the reality of it is that when kids hit a certain age, they're going to become sexually active, and you're not going to be able to ground them away from it or punish them away from it, or whatever the case may be. And I think that there needs to be things in place. They need education, they need information, and there needs to be places that they can go that are safe to prevent these things from happening, because I saw too many tragedies happen during my teen years, and I would never want things to go back to the way that they used to be.